So as seen recently on Scalagrim's channel, me and him found that scabbards, wooden scabbards at least, from the medieval period, absolutely suck at defending against sharp swords with. However, based on the studies of Fiore di Libri and other treatises, I can now reveal to you some ways in which a scabbard can indeed be used to effectively defend against a sword attack with. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now first up, thanks a lot to Scal for filming that video over at Todd's place recently. His video went up a couple of weeks ago. I'll stick a link down in the description down below to Scal's video if you haven't seen that one already. Now, it started from a very basic premise. People have asked him over the years, they've asked me over the years, can you defend with a medieval sword scabbard against a sword attack? And the basic conclusion of his video was that the scabbard is really easy to cut through. He and I both cut through one of Todd's scabbards. Nothing against Todd's craftsmanship because he makes very accurate and beautiful scabbards, but we found that a sharp sword goes straight through one like a hot knife through butter. But that doesn't mean that a scabbard is necessarily completely useless at defending against an attack with. And we're going to look quite quickly in this video with the help of my wonderful assistant Lucy Easton, who's kindly volunteered her services to this video. And we're going to look at some ways in which a scabbard can be used to enhance, assist, and just make more fun certain techniques of defending against an attack from a medieval sword. And indeed, obviously, a later period steel or iron scabbard, or even a brass scabbard, could be even more effective for these techniques. And in fact, there are sabre manuals where they do use the scabbard in the spare hand as a defensive item. But here we're going to specifically look at the use of the medieval sword with a wooden scabbard. But before we talk about my scabbard, let's talk about my sheath. Of course I'm talking about my pants. That's right, sheath underwear and other apparel, which are an absolute game changer. You might be wondering, what on earth has underwear got to do with my channel? Well, I'm guessing that most of you wear underwear, right? But apart from that, this is the underwear chosen by UFC fighters. And me, as it happens. I'm sure you've all had underwear which has either been too tight, too loose, too hot. This breathes and is wonderfully shaped and super comfortable. And for any of you who wear a cup or a box for fighting for martial arts, really good at holding that in place as well. They're great for the gym, they're great for any kind of exercise, and I promise you, this is a clean pair. And if you check out the link below to their website, you'll see that you can get t-shirts and all sorts of other things as well. And you can get pants in all kinds of funky different colours and patterns. You know, it's not that long until Christmas. Maybe you're hoping for some new underwear. Maybe you should ask for some sheath. Now, if we're talking about sheath underwear, I can't get around the fact that I have to mention the multi-pocket system, which keeps all of your, well, let's call it meat and veg, separate. If you want to wear them that way, you don't have to, but you can keep a nice sort of transference of air and keep everything cool down there if you're prone to getting hot. Gotta be completely honest, yes, it sounded like a weird idea, tried it out, actually pretty damn comfortable. Only way you'll know for sure is try some out. If you go and check out the link down below, maybe get a pair. If you like them, you can always go back and get some more. And as a special offer, you guys can get 20% off with the discount code SCHOLA at sheathunderwear.com. And you don't have to just take my word for it, because Sheath Underwear are the official sponsors of the UFC, and they know what they're talking about when it comes to martial arts pants, should we call them, underwear for fighting in, or just for relaxing, sleeping and chilling out in, or looking super cool. So go and check out sheathunderwear.com, and I hope that you find something there that will take your fancy. And thanks again to Sheath Underwear for sponsoring this video. Right, thanks a lot for sticking with me. Now back to the video. So we're going to categorize these into types. What are the main different ways that I can think of off the bat for using the scabbard to defend with? Now these techniques are, as I say, partly inspired by the treatises, particularly the works of Fiore di Libri, a little bit of Vardi as well. But additionally, they're also just based on my experience of using a weapon in each hand. And they're also extrapolated. So if you look at Fiore's section, for example, not only the use of the scabbard in Fury's treatise, but also the use of two sticks, because a lot of techniques where we have a weapon in each hand, can be it rapier or dagger or paired swords or whatever, can be adapted to the use of the sword and the scabbard either together or separately. And just a brief little technical note before we go into these, you will notice that in the techniques I'm going to show, I actually have the belt wrapped around the scabbard. Now this is an interesting detail and historically correct context for this particular question, should we say, for this particular experiment. And in actual fact, very often swords were carried in the hand like this with the belt wrapped around it, shown in numerous medieval paintings and manuscripts. And that does enhance the protective quality of the scabbard, because of course, while we could cut through the wood pretty easily, having a leather belt wrapped around it does of course enhance its protectiveness if you're blocking with that particular part of it. Anyway, let's get on to the techniques. Right, the very first basic thing that we have to address, and Scal did touch on this in his video in fact, is rather than directly opposing the edge of the incoming sword, doing more of a deflective action against the flats. Now it should be fairly obvious that while an edge can cut through wood and leather, if you go against the flat, that's obviously not going to happen. So if you have a trajectory of a blow coming down here, rather than interposing directly straight into the incoming edge, instead think about coming against the flats, and we can use this to move either to the inside or the outside of the blow. By that I mean if a person's giving the typical cut number 1 from the right hand side here, we could interpose the scabbard on the underneath of the blade or on top of the blade, and that leads us to different consequential techniques. It puts us in a different position. And of course, married to this, you can enhance the ability to come over or under the blade, inside or outside the blade, by moving offline. Now this is super important. So rather than, and you don't always have the choice, but rather than just sticking something in the way to sort of block it, instead, as your thing comes up to defend, moving offline, either inside or outside. And by moving to one side or the other, it increases your ability to put your stick, essentially your scabbard, against the flat of the blade instead of the edge, reducing the chances of the attacking blade cutting straight through the scabbard and potentially into you. Right, next up is a technique which is based on the idea of being unarmed against someone with a blade. So clearly if someone is swinging a bladed weapon at you, if possible, rather than trying to interact with the opponent's actual weapon, or rather blade, you can instead come in towards their hand or arm. And clearly if someone takes a swing at you like this, if you can come in and oppose the person's arm either outside or inside, then that's advantageous, because whether you're using just your bare left hand or you're using a scabbard in this case, by placing the scabbard onto the person's hand or arms, you can block that and hence the motion of the blade. And in the same tempo, that means in the same time, tempo is a fencing term, you can come in against the person's arm or hand and in the same tempo offend them, as well as blocking their attack. Now next up, this is something which people might not necessarily think of, because they'll think of this as a weapon and this as something to hold the weapon or potentially to defend with, but we can flip that around. We can defend the sword with the sword. So as the attack comes in, defend with the sword against their blade, as you would normally do if you didn't have anything in your left hand, and then actually attack in various ways with the scabbard. Now, depending whether you come on the inside line or the outside line, there's various ways of doing this, and there's various ways you could attack someone with a scabbard. Generally speaking, I would say that while you can strike someone with a scabbard, it's not going to do any more damage than a light stick. However, if it's in their face, that may cause pain, it might hit them in the eyes, and that may enable a follow-up attack. So you can defend with the sword, poke them in the eye with the scabbard, and that might give you the opening to then attack with the sword yourself. So by using this scabbard offensively, it might be confusing enough to them, or cause enough confusion plus pain, hopefully, that it will open them up to a further attack with your sword and create opportunities. Now, of course, flipping this around, we can look at the two weapon techniques that we find with the side sword, the paired side sword, for example, or indeed with two sticks in Fury's treatise, whereby we can do what we were doing before in the deflection against the flat and moving offline with the scabbard, and then in the same tempo hit with the sword. So you can marry these two things up into a number of interesting techniques that enable you to defend with the scabbard and immediately attack with the sword, or potentially do both at the same time. And if your opponent only has one sword, one item, in this case a long sword, then having those two things acting at the same tempo gives you an inherent advantage, and it's quite similar to some sword and buckler techniques as well. Now, something that we actually find in Fury's treaties, we also see a glimpse of in Vardy's as well and various other places, is actually using the two things together. Now, some people did actually, I think, note in the comments under Scal's video that while we can cut through the scabbard by itself, you clearly can't do that when the sword is still inside the scabbard, because now it essentially has a steel skeleton. I like the idea of that. A steel skeleton with a wooden leather body. And clearly you can defend in all sorts of ways with these two things still together. And once you've done that, clearly the opponent's blade, even if it bites into the wood and the leather, it goes through and meets your blade, it's going to stop at your blade, which means that having blocked with these two things, we can either use the two things together, still married together as a striking object, stabbing with the end of the scabbard, or pommeling on the other side, depending whether you come inside or outside. But obviously, once having done that, having blocked with the two things together, we can keep the scabbard there and unsheath our sword and now attack with our sword. And in fact, this is extremely similar to a technique shown in Fury against a dagger attack, where we actually block with the two things together, then we poke the opponent in the eye as we unsheath the sword, and then we can hit them with the sword. Now, another option, coming again from the paired swords techniques, or indeed from rapier and dagger, is actually, rather than defending with one item and attacking with the other, you can actually defend with both together. Now, this actually gives a really interesting option that we didn't look at when we were playing around in Todd's field for Scal's video. But by putting the blade as the primary defending thing, so essentially taking the blow from the opposing sword with your sword, but then bringing up your scabbard, you can augment and add the two things together. So this crossing of the two things together can actually be done in a variety of ways, whether the scabbard is downwards or upwards, whether the sword is upwards or downwards. So you can form a cross, an X essentially, that meets the opponent's attack. And because you've got the steel sword there, it is unlikely that your scabbard is going to get cut through. It might get bitten into slightly, it might get damaged, but it's there for long enough in order for you to bind against and cover against while you detach your sword and counter. So having put the two things up and formed your cross against the attack, you now keep the scabbard there and then you attack with your own sword. And the scabbard keeps the cover for you. This is actually quite similar to certain techniques where we actually initially cross with the sword, then we take over with the hand, then we counter with the sword. This is a very, very similar thing, but now we cross with both, we keep the scabbard there and immediately counter with the sword. So I hope this has been interesting to you. Remember that defending with a scabbard can take many, many different forms. I've covered some of the main ones in this video, but it's not simply about sticking a scabbard in the way. And what we found, and it was worth testing, but what we absolutely found in Scal's video was that you stand a really small chance of coming off unscathed if you just put a wooden scabbard in the way of a sword. However, thankfully, as I've just shown in this video, there are a whole bunch of better other options you can do instead. Even if you're walking along the street and you suddenly get attacked, and your sword is in the scabbard, there's a whole bunch of techniques where you can just throw the two things up together as a flinch response, and then your brain catches up. So just throwing the two things up together, bam, okay, I've just been hit, unsheath the thing and immediately run the person through. You can use the two things together. And a little detail, so we found how easy the scabbard was to cut into, yeah? But remember, if the sword's inside, it can't cut through, so it will go into the leather and the wood. And this is an experiment we could do in the future. I suspect it sticks there to some degree. I suspect it's a little bit like having an extra control point on the opponent's blade, because if the two things are together and their blade cuts into my scabbard and goes into the wood but stops on the steel, I can now pull my sword out, their blade is now stuck in my scabbard, at which point I can go absolutely ham on them with my sword. Just a theory. And that's another fun test that maybe we could do in a future video. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks to the sponsors for this video. Thanks to Scal for making the original video, which gave me the idea for this one. I have been Matt Easton, I will of course continue to be, and I really hope that you're subscribed. I hope that you'll give me a like, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.